What else can we talk about? We can talk about the face of tyranny that's peering behind the crumbling liberal democratic edifice. It always makes me laugh when we hear of political leaders like Bush, Blair, Brown, kind of criticising the tyrannical, illiberal, undemocratic nature of regimes out there, when it's becoming increasingly evident that the authoritarianism and tyranny is to be found in here, in our democratic West, with with all this sort of draconian anti-terrorist legislation, with the concentration of power in the hands of the executive, with things like indefinite detention, the daily erosion of civil liberties and democratic rights, the almost sort of open use of torture in interrogation. Bush actually tried to have torture legalized in several sort of legal bills and memos and so on. So all of these things reveal a kind of a tyrannical face, the face of tyranny, I think, that's sort of peering behind this facade. I would say that the politics of security is precisely dangerous to democracy. Security places a stranglehold on democracy. So what I would suggest is that contemporary post-democracy no longer resembles either the egalitarian idea of popular sovereignty, because we don't have any popular sovereignty, we don't have any transparency or accountability, nor does it resemble the sort of the liberal idea of democracy, which is about checks and balances, individual rights, and limited government. What we find here is precisely the opposite. We don't have limited government, we have unchecked government. We have a massive expansion, particularly of the security functions of government. We have a total sort of disregard and contempt for even the most kind of narrow, sort of negative liberal individual rights, and so on. So, I mean, we really have much more of a kind of a neoliberal system, which really has nothing to do with classical liberalism or political liberalism in any sense. It only offers a very kind of narrow model of consumerist and market freedom. And essentially the role of governments really is to no longer serve the people, but to privatize public space and to reconstruct their societies in accordance with the interests and the prerogatives of the global market. Okay, lastly, if there is a gap between these ideals and reality, how do we begin to bridge the gap, and do we even want to bridge this gap, and what are the alternatives? That's the last question. Okay, to bridge the gap that I've been talking about, I think requires both a restoration of what has been lost over the past couple of years, as well as a total reinvention of democracy. And this sounds like a bit of a kind of a paradoxical combination. Let me try to explain. This is a very difficult matter, because what I want to see is certain fundamental democratic rights and processes restored to the existing system, and I think this is essentially a conservative gesture. And I also want to see a wholesale reconstruction and a rethinking of democracy itself. But I think perhaps we can see both of these as part of the same process. So firstly, as a kind of a bare minimum condition, I would want to see the complete dismantling of the whole post 9/11 security apparatus, all of the sort of the legislation, all of the powers that have been given to the police and security agencies, the right to detain people without trial, all of the surveillance powers, etc., etc. I think have to be kind of rolled back. They have to be. This whole kind of security apparatus has to be dismantled. Civil liberties, previously existing civil liberties, such as they were, because they were quite limited to begin with, but I think they do have to be restored. Okay? So, we have to find ways of reining in, even through the very modest language of liberalism, reining in the power of the executive. Now, I think this is essentially a conservative gesture, even though it sounds quite radical and even utopian under today's circumstances. But I think it's also important because it kind of takes a stand against this sort of relentless logic of securitization. It suggests a politics of anti-security, and to propose a politics of anti-security is precisely to propose a democratic politics, because democratic politics is against security. Security is about closing down the public space. It's about securing and protecting. It's about, building walls and detention centres and so on. It's about limiting free speech. Democracy is about unpredictability. It's about vulnerability. And so you cannot secure democracy, because to secure democracy is to actually undermine it completely. Okay, the second point is that it's through this kind of restoration and expansion of democratic rights and liberties that other channels of democracy can be opened up, that other social and political and economic hierarchies can be challenged. Not only through formal democratic means, because as I said, these are quite limited, but also through extra parliamentary means such as activism, direct action, the kind of the fostering of autonomous political communities and practices which take place on both national and transnational scales. And this kind of politics is not new. It's been with us for quite a long time. It's taken different forms. It's taken the form of new social movements, for instance, and of various kinds. What we're seeing with the contemporary anti-capitalist movement or auto-globalization movement is a kind of a glimmer of what a different kind of democracy, a different kind of democratic politics can actually look like. And part of this rethinking, the third point is part of this rethinking of democracy will involve a construction and an articulation of an alternative vision of globalization. I think any serious consideration of democracy today has to take into account the fact of globalization and place it within the context of globalization. And the way that globalization is currently being imposed in a very undemocratic way, a very kind of inegalitarian way. Now, activists, of course, have proposed various reforms of the global system, such as, for instance, taxing global financial transactions, having a greater control over global finance. And this is obviously something which in the light of sort of recent events is becoming even more urgent. Also things like greater environmental protection, the development of sort of transnational human rights and international legal structures, and even certain models of post-national and transnational democracy which actually cut across national borders. My last point is that on a more philosophical level, and I've already alluded to this connection between democracy and anarchism, is precisely this incompatibility between democracy and state sovereignty. For me, democracy, pushed to its limits, taken to its ultimate conclusions, is an anarchism. Anarchists for a long time have been proposing all different kinds of decentralized, non-coercive, and directly democratic decision-making structures. And of course there have been a number of very important historical experiments, for instance, I mean, most notably the anarchist collectives in the Spanish Civil War. But there's no reason why these forms of egalitarian and libertarian democracy cannot be experimented with today. And they are being experimented with today, at the local level. It's going on all the time. Democracy is going on all the time. So is democracy dead? Well, I just want to turn to a very short quote from Marx to answer this question. Marx says, and I think this is from the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx says, in quotes, "It goes without saying that all forms of state have democracy for their truth, and that they are untrue insofar as they are not democracy." End quote. So democracy itself is not dead, only the regimes which claim to be democratic. I think that's what's dead, or at least dying. Thank you very much.